Okay, folks, today we're going to resort to breaking out the oscilloscope. Yep, because it helps us to see what we're going to do here. Okie dokie, what I'm going to show you in this video is how you can take the standard waveforms out of your voltage-controlled oscillator and make them get all bent out of shape. Like this, or this, or this, or this, and lots of other weird stuff. Now, this has two purposes. One, it broadens your tonal palette that you have to work with. It does have some limitations, and we'll talk about that in another video. But what I find even more interesting, just this is me, is to crank those suckers down to low sub-audio frequencies and use those slow, weird waveforms to control other things. Now that's what I like to do, among other things, of course. But those are the two reasons you might want to do it. We'll probably talk about both of those in another video. But today we're going to show you how to do that. So, off we go. Most of you are already familiar with what are usually the four basic waveforms out of your electronic music voltage-controlled oscillator. And one would be the sine, which is a pure tone. One would be the triangle, which sounds both audibly and when used for control purposes very similar. But the triangle, if you listen to it with your ears at an audio frequency, it's a little bit brighter. And then you have the sawtooth/ramp. But that's a very bright waveform. It's got lots of higher harmonic content. And then you've got the rectangular waveform. Most VCOs are capable of modifying the width of the pulse. That's known as the duty cycle. And in fact, most VCOs also add voltage control to that pulse width because it's easy to do in the circuit, and that means it's cheap, and it's really useful. You get some really cool sounds by varying the width of the pulse dynamically. So, anyway, now you may be thinking, but wait a minute, it sounds like this guy's going to go back behind the panel and start hacking the circuit. I can't do that. I don't know anything about electronic circuits. Well, you don't need to, because you know the only thing that you need in order to do this, to make all of those weird waveforms, is this. One little patch cord. Yes, that's all you're gonna need is one patch cord. So, if you're ready, off we go. I'm going to be using the Q106 VCO from synthesizers.com, but that's not really important at all. Any reasonable VCO should work just fine. I first discovered this little trick back in the mid-1970s with a homebrew VCO that I had made. So, any VCO you have should work just fine to do this. As I already mentioned, this technique requires only a single patch cord, and although when you do this, all of the outputs of your VCO will be affected simultaneously, we're only going to look at one to begin with, and that's going to be the sine, because the sine is a pure frequency, and when we bend it out of shape, it adds higher harmonic content, and so it's a lot easier to hear the timbral difference in the bent out of shape sine from the actual sinusoidal waveform. So here's the trick. We're actually going to control the frequency of the VCO, but in a very particular and I guess unusual way. It's not what you would usually think of as changing the frequency. Many, if not most, musical instrument VCOs will have multiple frequency control inputs, and to some extent it doesn't really matter which one of those inputs you choose. There will be slightly different results depending on the nature of the input, but I'm going to choose one that is a variable frequency control with an exponential response. Now again, that's not critical, and we'll look at the other cases in another video. So here we go. I'm going to plug one end of my little patch cord into the variable exponential control input, and now the question is, where does the other one go? And this is what is probably the surprise. We actually plug this puppy into one of the outputs of the same VCO. Now, it doesn't really matter which output you choose. Which output you choose will determine what sort of wave shapes you get out of the thing. Each of the outputs will give you some sort of an interesting result. I'm just going to choose the ramp. There's nothing magic about that. That's just the one I'm going to use for this first demo. So here we go. Aha! There it is. Now, you noticed probably two things as soon as I plugged that in. First of all, the pitch changed. It went down. It did not maintain the same pitch. Now that's a minor disadvantage of this technique, is that it does in general change the pitch as well as the wave shape or the timbre of the tone. But also, if you've got a reasonably good ear, you could also hear the difference in the tone quality of the bent out of shape waveform and the original sine. Now, let's compare those two directly. I've tuned another VCO to the same frequency as the bent out of shape VCO, and we're going to switch back and forth between the two to make it easy to hear that timbral difference. So here we go. Here's the sine, and here is the bent out of shape, what used to be a sine. Again. Unless you are tone deaf or in some other way hearing impaired, you could probably tell the difference in the tone quality or the timbre between those two waveforms, the sine and the bent out of shape, what used to be a sine. The bent out of shape sine sounds a good bit more like a sawtooth, although it's not quite as bright as a sawtooth. And it does indeed look a little bit like a sawtooth, although it's certainly not, and it's a good bit rounder, as it were. So, the basic idea is that in order to change the waveforms coming out of your VCO, you take one of the outputs, it doesn't really matter which one, and you feed that back into one of the frequency control inputs of that same VCO. In future videos in this Bent Out of Shape series, we will explore, first, the effect of the different outputs being fed back on the wave shapes that are generated. We'll also look at how adjusting the level control on those adjustable frequency control inputs affects the wave shapes. And we'll also look at the fact that all of the outputs of the VCO are affected simultaneously, not just one as we illustrated in this video. And some questions that we need to answer are, how does doing this affect the tuning or the tracking of the oscillator with the keyboard? Now, ideally, we would still want our oscillator with the bent out of shape waveforms to track the keyboard, so that if we go up an octave, the VCO goes up an octave as well. Now, we've already seen that doing this does affect the frequency as well as the wave shape, so we need to look at that. Will our bent out of shape waveforms still track the keyboard? And finally, we will actually discuss how this works. Now, not in terms of the electronic circuitry, because I realize most of my audience doesn't know anything about that. But we will look at how feeding the output of the VCO back to itself actually causes those wave shapes to change. And I think I can do that without getting very technical about it. So we'll see if I succeed. So anyway, until then, 再见.